Swedes' engagement in global war zones and intergenerational transmission of experiences of war among Bosnians in Sweden. I have recently had the pleasure of reading through the anthology Engaging Violence, Trauma, Memory, and Representation, edited by Professor Maček. The book is centered around the impact of secondary trauma experienced by researchers working with mass political violence. Using insights and skills gained from psychology, she is also a psychotherapist. Professor Maček has helped create resources to assist researchers to deal with the trauma of working on difficult subject matters, in her interest in methodology, political ecology, and more than human research. Her current project concerns the appearance of the Pacific oyster on the Swedish West Coast. I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Maček. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandbir, and thank you, Kathy, for inviting me, and all of you who are here. It's really a pleasure and honor to talk to so many people about these things. We can come back to oysters if you're interested in that. But I just wanted to introduce some ideas for the subject that I got from Kathy, which is basically how it is to do interviews with difficult or painful topics, and how can we as researchers, as interviewers, do this in the best possible way, both for us and for the science. So as you heard in this volume on engaging violence, I've actually written quite a lot about this in both in introduction and in my own chapter, but there are also other researchers like Kathy and some others who have written. So if you haven't checked that volume, I would really suggest to do it. I've reread it when I was preparing now for this symposium, and it's really useful. Okay, so first of all, I think we need to realize, we need to think about that situation we are in is very different on different occasions. You could be in the midst of a war or a genocide, as I have been, and interviewing in that sort of situation is different than if you're interviewing like in peaceful Sweden or Canada about something that happened 40 years ago or 20 years ago. I've been talking to colleagues in Ukraine last year, and they've been in this sort of, they were going to document what was going on there, but at the same time they were hit themselves. They were sort of living in the war themselves. So this changes very much how you, your position and what you can do in certain circumstances. I mean, you can't just take away the fact that your life is exposed and that you're in a sort of special state when you're in a war zone. Okay, so that's one thing. And the other thing is it depends a lot on who you are. You can be somebody who doesn't have any obvious connections to the problem at hand, to the painful and difficult situation like a war or a genocide, but you can also be a part of it. I mean, I worked in Bosnia during the war. I was not Bosnian, but I was former Yugoslav, and the war hit me not really as much as people in Bosnia, but more, for example, than people in Sweden. It sort of connected more to myself and my identity. So these are two things that are very important to consider. There is, in my view, there is no position or identity which is better for research. It is good if you're an insider, it is good if you're an outsider, it's good if you're there, it's good if you're not there when it happens. But it's different, and this is what we need to consider. It can be harder to be in a war zone. It can be harder to be one of the group that's been targeted by violence. But it doesn't diminish the possibility to do good scholarship and further the knowledge. Actually, it might actually enhance it if you take care, which is going to be my last part of this, what I'm going to say. But I wanted to make you aware of this, which you probably know. I think that a lot of things that I'm going to say now are things that you've been thinking about yourself, and if not, you at least have experience of quite a lot of it yourself. So it's good if you have own examples, and if you also ask afterwards questions which are most relevant to yourselves, because I can't really cover everything. Okay. So this is first, situation and our identities are important to think about. Why do these interviews become difficult? Because they do, and they do take a toll on researcher. That's, I think, established fact. If they don't, then the researcher has managed to cut off quite a lot of emotional and empathic sort of communication, which is fine, but then quite a lot of information is lost in these interviews. So why do these sort of interviews affect us? Because of our capacity to empathize with fellow human beings. And there are different ways of defining empathy, but basically what happens is that I, as a researcher, can in some way identify with what the interviewee is telling me. If I can't, I can at least identify with the emotions the interviewee is expressing, the nonverbal sort of communication that happens in every human interaction, even in interviews. And this capacity for empathy is our source of information very much as words, I would say. Words are good, they're easy to analyze, they're very logical, and they happen in a different part of the brain, but they can induce emotions, affects, memories, but also there is much more than just words. There is communication through gestures and emotions. And what happens when they're a difficult subject is that you get these difficult emotions, and quite often also quite unbearable emotions. Things that are unbearable are very hard to express for the people we are interviewing, for the interviewees. And sometimes there is, I'll just mention one of psychological phenomena, which I've also written about, which is called projective identification. This is a way of communicating something that we can't really bear. We can't put it in words. Often it comes like a horror story, a terrifying story, which is which is related, which is told without adequate affect. It can be even, people can even smile, and just their emotional communication doesn't respond to the content of what they're saying. But what happens is that listeners pick up the content, the emotional content, and it can be really heavy. This is very, very sort of primitive in the sense that it's not psychologically mature way of communicating that babies have with their caretakers. A baby cries, is very distressed, the world is falling apart for the baby. The caretaker picks it up, but knows that the world is not falling apart, and communicates it back that this is okay, and takes care of the baby. This is the original situation for this concept. But it happens also in situations of when we research on very difficult topics that are not possible to put in words for the people we're interviewing, for the people who are talking to us. And Nerina Weiss in this volume, Engaging Violence, has a chapter on that. There is an example of this happening to her in the field. Okay, but this sort of stories and that people tell us, or interview content, also triggers our own experiences, and that's why it's important who we are, not only politically in a certain situation, but also what our psychological experiences are. Basically, some of us are more stable, had better growing up conditions, others are more vulnerable and had more difficult time to survive psychologically during our growing up years. And again, nothing of this is worse or better, but it's good to know about our own vulnerabilities in order to recognize when interviews trigger something in us which is difficult for ourselves. This doesn't diminish the value of our research, because if the interview has triggered the difficult thing, then it's probably out there in the interview too. But we can't just assume it, that what I feel is what the interviewee feels. We need to check it. So this is a methodological way of using our own reactions to check back what's actually been said and what the interviewee has to say. So it's important to be self-reflexive and to know yourself. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to mention was something that Kathy reminded me of, that there is a concept of vicarious trauma, which we actually didn't really know before this symposium we had in 2012. There was a trauma psychologist who introduced it to us. A more known concept is secondary trauma. This is trauma that people in a family experience when people in the family of a traumatized person experience, like the second generation, like children of people who've been in concentration camps, for example. This is secondary trauma because children themselves have not experienced anything traumatic, but their parents have. And through the way the parents behave, children also receive a picture or a sense of the world that is unsafe, basically, because that is traumatic experience, is the one that is overwhelming, in the sense that you feel that you're going to die. And it's very hard to integrate psychologically because it's unbearable. So people react very differently to this. Some people over-communicate what they've been through, others are silent, but children pick up the sense of the world being a dangerous and overwhelmingly dangerous place. But they don't know why, really, because they don't have any facts, they don't have stories, they haven't experienced anything themselves directly, but there is this sense of urgency, emergency, and terror, horror. We can experience the same thing as interviewers when we pick up things from the people, the interviewees, but we pick up the fears, the anxieties, the horror, the unbearability of the whole experience, but we don't really have that experience ourselves. So we pick up just emotions. And these we can connect to our own experiences as well in a very meshy way, and it's really hard sometimes to distinguish what is what, but these things trigger things that perhaps we've been through some difficulties in our own lives. And this sort of enmeshment of our own experience and what we are hearing in interview causes this vicarious traumatization, a sort of traumatization that you start looking at the world as if you have experienced what the interviewing is telling you, as if world is as dangerous and unpredictable, horrible as it is in this other person's experience. Here it is important, again, to know yourself and to not disconnect, because of course the world of the interview, and you are using your own experiences to understand, and but at the same time it's important to distinguish between their world experience and the world that you are living in, actually yourself. I have some examples from dealing too much with the literature on Rwanda. I sort of started noticing young men in pink shirts in Swedish parks in summer, and I immediately thought about prisoners in Rwanda's after Rwandan genocide in prisons there, genocidaries, and was instantly in this sort of very violent and horrible world, while actually sitting in a nice summer warm Swedish park, looking at a young man who is probably just well dressed and thinks he looks nicely. And this is a bit tricky because our brain connects quickly these things, and it's really important to be aware that this young man in this Swedish park is not a genocidary. It doesn't have to do anything with violence. He actually is probably a very safe and nice person who would probably help me if something happened to me. Okay, I think my time is slowly running out, so I'll just say some things about how we can work with this at our departments and institutions of different kind. Yes, there was this other thing that Kathy reminded me of. I've actually already mentioned the horror stories, but it's a concept from Laurie Perlman, little horror stories. This is a phenomenon when we work with difficult things, but don't know how to deal with it. So we do this, what I earlier talked about, projective identification on our colleagues. You go into a coffee room or lunch room and you start telling a horrible story from your material, which is bothering you, of course. But you sort of retell all the nasty details of it to your colleagues, and you can do it with a good energy and very self-assured, while your colleagues' unintentional role, or unconscious rather role there, is to pick up the horror of the story, and they do quite often. And in this way, you sort of project on them what you can't bear yourself, and then you can go on and continue doing research on very difficult and painful things. Well, they can't stand it, and they like leave the room or need to go home and are exhausted and often think actually that they're weak persons who cannot tackle this sort of hard material, while you go out as a hero and you are the tough one. So and this is of course not very good or productive way of dealing with it. So to tackle this, it's very good in the first place to be aware of these psychological both difficulties and mechanisms that are at work, and to secure different safe environments where you can respect each other and trust each other. And this is really crucial. It can be done in different ways. It can be a network, it can be in supervision, it can be in individual supervision, it could be group meetings, regular seminars. Well, some other organizations have debriefing. It could be so also at departments, but it's not usual. And peer support generally works quite a long way. So this is one thing that's important. Another is to have a sort of own flexibility in going in and out of difficult themes or feelings. Often we feel something that's connected to survivor's guilt, that if people are having such a horrible experiences and having such a difficult time afterwards, you can't just ignore that and have fun. You need to be all the time focused on that horrible part of life, and you can't give yourself a break, which is not good, because in the long run you just tear down your own capacity to work basically and deal with things. So it's very important to be able to go into your difficult research and leave it, step out and leave it for a while. It won't disappear, and you won't be less responsible or engaged or so this is also one thing. And the other thing is and often we do get the different symptoms, like one of the things is that it's very difficult to leave this sort of themes, and you just start getting more and more immersed in, like for myself, in different genocidal stories and films and culture and everything. Then you often get also physical symptoms in different ways. So once you know yourself and notice that, you need to take care of your body as well. So anything from getting out, moving, yoga, meditation, arts, anything that works for you to sort of re-establish some